Hey everybody, this is Richard Ruane, and we are here today to talk about queer horror. And I have an amazing panel of fantastic guests, and am so grateful to A Weekend with Good Friends for giving us a chance to come together and discuss this. And I am going to start by letting them introduce themselves, and we're going to start, I think, with Camille.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be on this panel. I'm Camille. I use they, them pronouns. I am a player on the How We Roll podcast, um, where I've played quite a few different queer characters so far, because that's what I like to do. And yeah, just really excited to be here.
And moving over to Candace.
Hello, everyone. My name is Candace. My pronouns are they, she. You might know me as Candace Magnificent. I'm a streamer and TTRPG player and voice actor, and I'm super excited to be here.
Nick.
Hello, I'm Nick. I am a player on the Ain't Slayed Nobody podcast, and I am so happy to be here, and I love talking about representation, so I'm excited for this. I have she, her pronouns, and yeah, I think that's it.
How about you, Perry?
Hello, I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I also run a podcast called Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered, which focuses on mental health and multiple intersections, including gaming and such. And I'm also one of the casts over on Symphony Entertainment, and we ran an episode of Richard Rook's Moonlight on Roseville Beach, which I played Solomon Hope.
And finally, Ambrose.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ambrose. I go by she, they pronouns. I am the creative director and founder of Other Side Studios, which is a horror and investigative focused channel on Twitch and YouTube. I am also an award-winning TTRPG performer and all these wonderful faces here. So yeah, I'm excited to get into it. Let's do.
All right. I am Richard Ruane. I'll be your moderator. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the creator of Roseville Beach and the forthcoming Haunting of Cliff Cove. And I am so excited to be talking to these folks today. And I'm going to start with a little bit of an icebreaker question. And I'm going to work a little bit, I think I may sort of work backwards and start with Ambrose this time.
Oh, no, I was like, oh no, that's all. I was like, me? That's about it. No, go ahead.
I'll pick on everybody before we're done. But what is sort of like what was sort of like your first sort of chance to sort of see horror with queer people and queer context or queer characters? And it could have been a game. It could have been not innate to the text of the game, but something you brought in. It could be a movie, a short story, a novel. Ambrose, what about you? What was sort of like your sort of intro?
I'm gonna be honest, like it wasn't really in media because my media literacy wasn't that great like 3 years ago. I'm starting to digest a lot now. But I would say that when I got into tabletop role-playing games, game-wise, I only really played with, whether by accident or like, oh, we gravitated towards each other, which is entirely queer tables or mostly queer tables. So it felt natural to step into that, and then digesting more media and realizing that there was a lot of wrong ways of showing queer representation in art or just media in general made me really sad. So then it felt like I had a lens of, how do you put it, where it's just like I might be a little harder on it than anything else, unless like I'm like, hey, can we represent people like in versus like caricatures of who they are, kind of situation. So I would say that backwards, working into it personally, because make your own, and then let's see what other people are making out there that are official representations in media. It's me.
Perry, what about you?
That's a tricky one because there's also that standpoint of, are we talking like playing your game was one of those chances of doing queer horror, but I also have to look back at where and what I was reading growing up and so forth. And the closest thing that pops to mind is Mercedes Lackey's Magic Pawn.
Oh, wow.
And the aspect of this queer character who's clearly, as I'm now going back in reflection, coded as queer, but dealing with the fact that he's got all this magical power and he just wants to die. And just that notion of who are the people that are pushing for and supporting the idea that he can die versus those who are going to save him or want him in the world. And so that is one of those examples of the ongoing queer horror of, can I exist in this world? Which also gets into mental health too. So,
oh right, yeah, definitely. Oh, what about you, Nick?
So I similarly kind of got introduced to it through tabletop role-playing games. I was often the only female at a table, and so it just kind of started out being easier to play male characters, and then that kind of evolved into, trying to incorporate without, trying to be like the token queer character or anything, trying to kind of subtly incorporate queerness and just non kind of like heteronormative aspects of characters into my play. I was actually thinking back to, like Perry, about what I was reading when I was growing up. I don't know if it counts as horror, but I feel like Interview with a Vampire might have been the first book I read with any kind of queer character in it, and just blew my young little mind.
Oh wow, okay. Candace, what about you?
It's funny. That's actually my answer. My introduction to queer horror was Interview with the Vampire. The movie came out when I was a kid, and my mom had a rule that I was not allowed to watch rated R movies unless I had read the book. If there was a book. If there wasn't a book, then it was an automatic no. But if I read the book, it was like a challenge, and that one was really thick, and she was like, "You're never reading that," and I did. So that was probably the first time that I ever really thought about it in that way. Around the same time, though, I was into R.L. Stine and Christopher Pike. And Christopher Pike had a lot of queer characters for that time in his YA novels. So that for me, I think, was a huge open door. I think I've always kind of known that I was queer. Like my first time that a girl kissed me, I think I was like 5 or something, and someone kissed me goodbye, and I was like, oh. So I think everything kind of took a lens from there on for me. In TTRPGs, I think all of my characters have been queer. I don't really play like straight people. So I think for me, I kind of keep that alive in my every experience for the most part.
I used to joke that I played heterosexuality to the lark for so long that I'm tired of playing straight characters. So, Camille, what about you?
Well, I was very sort of allergic to horror when I was growing up. I really, really avoided it. So I didn't kind of consume a lot of horror media until maybe just a few years ago, but kind of trying to cast back to like queer media, because I definitely sought out queer media a lot when I was a teenager. Mostly like fan fiction and in like anime and stuff like that. That was a big thing for me as well. And there was one that I always loved watching called Number Six, an anime, and it's kind of like a dystopian sci-fi fantasy kind of show. And it has like just a really wholesome queer relationship despite kind of like everything else that's going on around them. And that's always kind of stayed with me as like a really interesting example. So I guess maybe just looking further back, that was something I watched at a bit of an earlier age that was a bit more like hard hitting and yeah, dystopian. So definitely not cheerful. But yeah, I similarly like got into horror when I started playing TTRPGs. Really, I fell into a horror campaign, and then I fell into a horror podcast, and I was like, this is weird. Here I am. So I kind of retroactively started watching more horror stuff off the back of that. So yeah, still kind of dipping my toe in the water, but yeah. So I guess yeah, playing queer characters has always been pretty essential to me, like in the podcast. I think I kind of played characters early on when I started playing TTRPGs, because I think it's been about 11 years now. And I think I either played kind of like straight by default characters, but romance and stuff wouldn't really come up. But now, even if I know that I'm not interested in exploring romance with my character. It doesn't come up at all. I'm like, I know what they're about though. I know what their orientation is. I know what their like gender identity is, you know. It's something I kind of think about quite specifically now. Yeah, so interesting.
So I think my first question is sort of like establishing sort of what is queer horror. We know that frequently it can feel horrible in the last 50, even 60 years to have been a queer person encountering the biases and bigotry of straight society. But queer horror is not just queer drama. So how do we distinguish things that are queer horror, whether in a game, whether in a movie, from just a really fantastic movie like Boys Don't Cry? It was very groundbreaking in the 90s and had a very awful, frightening story, but was not necessarily horror. So what is horror about queer horror? What is we know sort of what queerness is. How do we sort of like think about sort of what makes horror horror? And Ambrose, I see your hand up, so I'll start with you.
Yeah, I know it was first with the last icebreaker question, but like I've been thinking about this one for a little bit as soon as we knew the question. For me, and any with horror, or at least how I view horror, a lot of people think that it's just the method of being scared or having high adrenaline or being on the edge of your seat with anxiety. You can gain anxiety from the day to day, and with queerness, it's for at least me, it's people viewing or trying to make an assumption of my identity without like knowing me first. So taking that concept and then blowing it up in terms of hyperbole, in terms for horror purposes, and how does that look? There's like using the method of otherness, using the other side or looking in kind of situation, and and then what is the worst possibility or the worst outcome that could possibly happen, and then blowing that up. So instead of being like admonished, is it having your identity stolen? Is it what does that look like in a supernatural lens or a horror lens? So yeah, like I would say like taking something like that, that's something that horrifies me personally, where someone makes an assumption of me just based off of how I look or how I perceive myself. Because like recently, having my hair cut a certain way like has changed viewpoints for me in the last 2 weeks that I noticed, and I'm being called certain names because of it. But positive and negative. So it's just like, I just like let it roll off. But the horror in the back of my head of someone taking that and then doing something physical about it is a little horrifying. So yeah.
Yeah.
Because now like gender euphoria for me is not gender euphoria for someone perceiving me, is the best way to put it.
Anyone want to go next? I can pick on specific people, or but I'll let people sort of jump in. Camille, Candace, sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I think I echo everything that Ambrose is saying for sure. Lots of that is horrific to me. I think from like a media perspective, when you think intersectionality, because I am a Black person as well, there's a lot of comparing like my queerness to my Blackness. There's a lot of movies like Boys Don't Cry, right? Like 12 Years a Slave. Like those are moments that are horrific because something real actually happened. And it's terrifying. But like something that I find to be queer horror, like the definition of queer horror, even Black horror for me, I feel like to push that envelope moving forward rather than kind of having these, important stories to tell, right? Of things like that, but also limiting that to like an essential experience of being in that body, being in a queer body, being in a Black body. What I really like about queer horror is when someone goes beyond that rather than presenting me with horror because something is horrific. Horror being something where everything is fine and you think things are okay and then they're not, right? Like rather than queerness being what's driving the horror, right? The lack of acceptance, or rather than Blackness or whatever other marginalization driving that narrative. I really, really enjoy it when it's just part of the story and the horror is that something unexpected or bad is happening to people. So for me, a big one that I just recently watched, I want to say within the last 6 months, is Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. that is a movie that takes queerness and just puts it right out front, right? It hangs it right in the window. You know exactly what you're dealing with. 5 seconds in, there's 2 women, they're in a relationship. It's not scary because it's queer. It's scary because something horrible happens to these queers. And then they have to figure out, what am I going to do about it, right? So I think that, like, there's like another element of that, I think, for me. Like, it's definitely scary when you see something that is not outside the realm of possibility, because it's scary to imagine it happening to you. But I also really enjoy queer horror where either A, it's just horror that happens to be happening to people who are queer, or B, that otherness and that sense of a lack of self-control, like The Skin I Live In, by Almodovar, where like your personhood is taken from you despite in spite of who you are. So I think that's where I'm at with queer horror right now, is being more interested in those tales where queerness is in the foreground up front, and it's not used as the vehicle to scare me.
Right. Yeah. Anyone else on that particular sort of like, what are the boundaries between just kind of queer drama and queer horror?
I just wanted to say that was awesome. That's all I wanted to say. Proceed.
And I have a question that I'm about to knock over to Perry, because you suggested it, and let you sort of be the first person to talk about it. You had talked a little bit when we chatted, queer horror not just being a rehash of queer traumas. Could you kind of expand on that and sort of kind of what your thinking is like horror isn't just an like a rehash of trauma. What else does it need to be horror? How would you sort of draw some lines about good horror storytelling that isn't just a rehash of?
Yeah, because I think the queer trauma porn is also similar to black trauma porn as well, in the idea that whatever storyline that's going on seems to center itself in who we are as our existence. So, for example, I think it's Lena Waithe's Them, and the aspect of you've got a black family who's moving to essentially a haunted house you got the haunted house, but you've also got the racist community around them. So there's both inside and outside. And the fundamental question of everything that they go through, when does it actually stop? And so the same thing can be said for queer trauma porn. Where's the thing that is constantly attacking the sense of who you are and your being in the world? For an example of classic horror, think about The Stepford Children, which was about creating conformity around their kids and have the image they put forth. So imagine how many of those kids would be examples of queer characters now being forced to conform to the social idea of their community. And dealing with that sense of the thing that's constantly being attacked is the thing that makes us who we are. And that then becomes also an area where the people who are thinking about trying to create these, because in our earlier, before we started, we were talking about the Shudder's queer horrors and this aspect that it kept going back to vampires. It's like, there are a multitude of other ways we can be expressed in this world other than just vampires. It's a tired trope. We have breadth and width of what we exist in this world, from not just what we go on with in the classic high school stories to what does it mean for queer aging? What does it mean for dealing with queer relationships, especially mature relationships? So how do we not turn that into, just because you're queer, your entire relationship is always doomed? And we come back to, which I know one of the topics we're going to talk about, bury the gays. But there's the other standpoint. If you're not burying the gays, you're sticking them in a mental institution, which is also part of the tropes that come up around queer horror, was that. And your Moonlight, the covers and so forth, is based so much off of queer novels of that time, and their usual outcomes was either someone died or someone basically went mad and got locked up in a mental institution. So that becomes something that's like, can you think about something more than that?
Right. Yeah.
What else could we do beyond that? Because those are the tried and true existing horrors that we live with as a daily basis. So is this the same type of fear response for us as it would be for the audience who's watching it?
Candace.
I feel like, just to add to what you're saying, Perry, there's such a fine line now that more creators are having access to tell a variety of stories, right? Like, Them was very poorly received by some people. And there were a lot of questions of who is this for, right? Is this a PSA for white viewers and non-black viewers? Is this, something that's supposed to appeal to black viewers? I feel very much that line is straddled constantly by Ryan Murphy as a creator. American Horror Story and everything that goes along with all of the stuff. Like, he's a very prominent queer filmmaker and queer television maker, right? Showrunner. And sometimes it's fantastic, and I watch it and I'm just like, this is the gayest drama in the world. Popcorn, popcorn, right? Sometimes it's everything that I want. It's the smut that I need, the trash show that I want. But then sometimes I watch it and I'm like, this is really reductive. Like, what are other people watching, right? Like, I got through maybe 3 episodes of the Hotel season before I was just like, sir. So, like, it's so difficult to me, like, kind of trying to decide what to consume and what to leave on the table now that there's so much to choose from. And even so much to choose from still is not enough. We still need more. We need better representation. We need more interesting stories from a variety of queers, right? Not just this one cis man that is doing his thing. But I feel like, it's been hard for me to decide, bringing it back to that brief discussion we had about, Shudder queer horror stories. Like, how do you decide what you're willing to spend that time on? There's only so many hours in a day. We're all working. We all have lives. We all have things that we need to be doing. So, like, how do you decide what to consume and what to leave behind, especially in a time when you want a story that's going to appeal to all of you and not just a piece of you?
Right. Ambrose, and then Nick.
Okay, I was like, oh, Nick. I kind of going back to Them because that's immediately what came to mind, like, in terms of, like, not queerness, but like black horror porn. I just remember watching the clip for it, or at least like the trailer for it, and thinking, who is this for exactly? Was this like on the back of Us, and this is what they were trying to do, and what were they trying to go for? So I didn't watch it, but like most of us lately, we watch our media, or at least get a nice little synopsis from TikTok. So, like, I watched little clips of it that were enough, and they were strong visuals, but it was the concept of it just never stops, and I think that's a little too real when it comes to, like, fiction or storytelling. There is an element of, like, what is it, like, fiction, like, reality is stranger in fiction, or reality is worse in fiction sometimes, because sometimes it doesn't stop in reality, in storytelling, right? And that's the harsh reality of it sometimes. We don't want that in our media if we're trying to tell a story. There is, like, a certain breadth of cadence into a story of, like, there has to be a main point from the beginning to the middle to the end. It can't just be horror for the sake of horror. It can't be, and not talking about a particular genre here. Well, subgenre in horror, but you can't just have, like, gore for the sake of gore, even though that used to be a point for horror, like, in the early 2000s, where it's just like, yeah, we're just gonna murder. We're just gonna murder, like, teens for no reason. Like, we're just gonna kill everybody on screen, and then there's gonna be a survivor. But did they actually survive, or are they always looking over their shoulder? Like, what was the point? That was gore porn, right? So, like, now it's just like, oh, well, who can we focus on now after that? Like, I want to be invested and be sucked in, and also jump back in my seat with it. So yeah, that's the only fine point I was gonna tell, where it was just like, hey, well, who is this for? Like, I don't want to see that. Like, I don't want to see someone that is similar to my identity going through suffering, because, like, I deal with that. I don't need that in my media. I sat down, got my popcorn, got my blanket. Like, I have a moment from work, whatever. I don't want to see that in my reality, when I just want to break from it, even if it is horror, even if it was designed to terrify me. There has to be a point at the end of it. That's horror.
Nick, what about you?
I also, the idea of, like, who is this for? I mean, fundamentally we want to get to a place where, you know, queerness or any kind of like personal like demographic, it's not, like, you don't have to split it, right? It's for everyone. It's so normalized that we're all good. We're on the same page. But right now it doesn't feel like we are there. And so the idea of, is this for someone in the community or is it for people outside the community, as a way sometimes of just exposure, right? Just the kind of exposure therapy angle of it. And that second one is the one that feels tricky, because sometimes you have well-meaning allies who will try to do their best to represent something that they do not live, an experience that they don't live themselves, and they don't get it right. And then it's a question of, okay, so what do we do? Do we just kind of say, great, at least they tried? Or do we actually start to go in? Are we at the point where we can start to go in and ask more of people who are trying to represent queer folks who aren't necessarily part of the community? And then that always makes me think of, like, you know how they say there's no such thing as bad publicity? Is there such a thing as bad representation? And I think obviously the answer is yes.
Yeah.
It could be extremely harmful. And you know, how do we correct without making people afraid of telling stories and bringing, you know, more diverse representation into those stories?
Camille.
I just wanted to kind of add on to what Nick was saying, as well as kind of going in and informing the people like the Ryan Murphys. I also love American Horror Story, some of it, but you know, going in and saying, hey, didn't quite get this right, or like, how can we represent it? Also, just getting more people from a more diverse, intersectional range of backgrounds behind the camera, behind the best-selling novel, behind whatever kind of craft we want to put these stories out on. And yeah, just kind of build that up. I think Candace was saying about having just more diverse representation. More, please. We have more choice now, but even more. Yeah, I think yeah, just getting more people out there, definitely.
Anything else anybody wants to add? Because I think I'm ready to move on to my next question, unless there's something people want to jump in on. And that's something that applies both to sort of the horror media that we consume as queer people, and also how GMs and players bring queer people into their horror games. Is we've talked, and I think Candace spoke, and so many of you spoke really powerfully to, like, what do we look for in a queer protagonist? But we know that as part of being fleshed out queer people and fleshing out the real places that queer people exist in the world, we frequently have queer antagonists, whether that's like a more personal relationship of antagonism, or whether it's a big relationship of antagonism. I struggled mightily with American Horror Story in New York City, because there was so much good and so much bad in it. But I think one of the things that Ryan Murphy did fairly well is just bringing in evil queer rich men. What are y'all's thoughts on doing queer antagonists, bringing in antagonists who are queer people or queer identified? Candace.
I have very strong opinions on marginalized villains. Very strong. To me, in a TTRPG, a show, a book, whatever it is that you're making, if you're going to have a queer person or any marginalized person as the villain, there needs to exist a balance. I do not want to read or consume or be a part of any story where the queer hero, or like the queer antagonist, is just antagonistic and terrible and nihilistic and just wants to ruin everybody and preys on young people, or like whatever trope that has existed for so long. There's a lot of that. Tons of queer coded villains, right? Tons of that, where they're just unapologetic. Some of them are done well. Some of them are great queer coded villains, and you're like, oh man, this is so good, right? But at the same time, there has to exist balance. So we were talking about Doctor Who earlier as well. Doctor Who is sci-fi, but there are some horror elements. One of the specials for Doctor Who, I believe it is number 3, introduces the new Doctor, who we know is queer. The Doctor is queer, this new Doctor, openly, which is outstanding to see, because why wouldn't the Doctor be queer? You can transform into anybody. clearly somebody's going to be queer, right? So there is a villain in that episode who is also queer, played by Neil Patrick Harris. And the duality and dynamic between those two individuals is exceptional. If you're going to have a queer villain, you have to have a queer protagonist. Like, it can't be one-sided. It can't be a bunch of evil people and then the sidekick is queer, so it's okay, right? Like, you have to have somebody that is doing the right thing. They can be complicated. They can be, you know, they can even be an anti-hero. Maybe they take, you know, a piece of that villain with them to do good things. You can make it complex. It doesn't have to be, you know, one for one and it's rote and it's boring. But I think that there has been very much a drive to show queer villains in the name of like diversity, right? In the name of, well, you know, not everybody is straight, see? But like when you're showing those negatives and you're showing things that maybe are real criticisms of this character as a queer, you know, person, it can be really difficult to not leave that nasty taste in a viewer's mouth about queer people outside of that bubble, outside of the table, outside of the movie theater, TV show, right? And I think when you're creating NPCs, it's important to make sure that there are queer people within this universe, or you marginalize your players, right? Something Ambrose said about them and not wanting to watch that because, like, I already have this kind of going on in my life and I'm dealing with it and I am burnt out and I am exhausted and I would like to escape. That's something that I find a lot at tables where, you know, someone has done outreach and they've asked me to come and play at their table. They're like, I need a queer person and you're also Black and please come. And I show up and I'm the only Black person in the entire kingdom, right? Kingdom of hundreds of thousands of people, only Black person there. And I'm also the only queer. There's maybe one village girl that thinks I'm cute and that's it, right? Like in modern video games, something that I've seen that I feel we can take big pieces of for our tabletop, and I know I do, is having NPCs that are fluid, right? Baldur's Gate 3, part of the reason people are like freaking out about Baldur's Gate 3 is because you can romance whoever the hell you want. Everybody is open. Everyone's like, hello, how are you doing today, right? Like, if you're a GM, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. Now, can you have a straight NPC that will not flirt with me because I'm a femme character? Sure, that's an option. That's life, right? That's okay. But I'm not playing this game for life. I'm playing this game for escape and fantasy. So if that busty maiden or that well-hung gentleman or that handsome androgynous creature is open to dating whoever, then let me date them, right? Let me go in there and enjoy myself. So I think that balance, that flexibility of allowing your players to just exist in this world and have the world be responsive and reactive to them is something that's like a level up from what we get in media. You know, I can't change, you know, whether or not my favorite characters are queer, you know? I mean, if you know anything about Supernatural, which I've never watched the show, but I know all about the drama. If you've ever watched an episode of Supernatural and Castiel, right, and the whole arc with this angel, right, fans were like, that character is gay. That is a homosexual. And everyone was like, sure. The writers were like, honestly, yeah. The network was like, no. And it ended in flames and ruined things for a lot of people because it was so rigid that there was no room for the fantasy and for the idea of it all, right? Even if it's Legend of Korra, where you leave very little to the imagination, they ride off into the sunset together, but you never get to see a kiss and you never get to see the relationship. That's still representation for someone. And I think having that balance is so important in all of the media we consume, but especially at the table in TTRPGs. It is so lonely to be the sole queer person at a table and feel like you can't even like be yourself in this entirely made up fantasy world. That's something I'm super passionate about.
Ambrose.
Amazing. I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, did you like Perry? You want to go? I can go. After.
Actually, Ambrose and then Perry.
Ambrose and then I'll
Okay.
jump in.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. So it is something I'm also passionate about, and kind of layering off of what Candace said. So ultimately, as being a Black femme queer person, like I love playing antagonists. It's like my favorite thing in the world because when you're just the bad guy, but you're the only Black person there, like, or you're the only other there out of everybody else, I want to experience that accurately. Like there is a whole history behind a person. Like someone isn't just a bad guy because they're a bad guy, right? Like we would love that, as Disney has made us feel that that's how it is. They have made people caricatures to show that. They enhance their visuals so that very defined features to be memorable and also unattractive is the best way to put it. That's not fair. It's not just that. It's They're very beautiful people that are horrible, absolutely horrible. And they should also have the right to be antagonistic. And they have a story. And it's beyond the looks or beyond identity or beyond the color of the skin there. So when it comes to queer antagonists, like I have a queer antagonist in one of my actual plays, and they have a whole reason why they did what they did. They are over 200 years old. They tried to change themselves, and they lost someone that they dearly care for, and now they want to solve the problem, but they lost their way along the way. And there's a whole reason for why they do that. And of course, they're not the only queer person or queer entity there. They're monsters, they're humans, and like as I play NPCs, similar to what Candace said, you can romance any of them. Go off. Like I know, like there might be in a heteronormative relationship with someone, one of the characters. I'm like, no, like all of them. Like doesn't matter who approaches them. Just ask. Or if you're uncomfortable, like because session 0 and like finding out how people feel comfortable in terms of relationships is important. In terms of like during a session 0, I'm like, yeah, if you're okay with it, I'm okay with it. So it is important to be able to see the good in people, and it's okay to not be the bad, not to be a good guy sometimes as well. Explore that side of yourself, because hey, like there's times when I'm like villainaire right now, let's go, because I'm tired, like, but also like no, I can't just do that. Like I need to be a decent person today, and you want to show that side or role play that side as well as being the hero, making the right decisions. And it's not fair that you have to be good in representing being queer or black, and you can't also be bad, like because like hey, that is something that is easily to switch over to because of experiences or anything like that. So yeah, that's all I would have to say.
Yeah, to add to that is also the aspect of, and this is a couple of different things come to mind here, is the aspects of where we're also looking at influences that have had on what we think of as modern horror, and this aspect of the gay antagonist or LGBT antagonist is the aspect of there's ways that, in the ways the scripts and stories get written, that to be that person is somehow now a challenge against heterosexuality and heterosexual sex as well, and that not giving this character more reasons beyond their sex to have these issues. Yeah, their entire house was burned down because somebody wanted the land, so they're now to have found a way to get their land back, but they're doing it in the vengeful way. That's not a character that we're getting tied to, but the family who took over the land now gave it to their kids as their wedding gift. So where does that now become that coding aspect of it? It becomes trickier because we're also seeing it in our normal lives too. Because as a therapist, one of the things I encounter, especially when dealing with the subject of intimate partner violence, is the idea of it's strictly domestic violence. It's between a man and a woman. In intimate partner violence, you have one man who might very well be the abuser, but you got another man who's the victim. You've got a woman who very much is going to be the victim, but you got another woman who is being the perpetrator. And if we go into the non-binary standpoint, either one of these qualities is regardless of sex, is regardless of the gender identity. And so when we're looking at creating these antagonists, or even just creating these stories in general, how are we removing the idea that the sexuality and the gender is the cause for them to be evil or be antagonistic in some way or shape or form? And so there becomes an aspect of how are you actually conceptualizing building these characters as, again, the gender and sexuality is a part, but not the total person who still has to live in this world. So when we create these characters, we've got to give them more than just because of their sex and gender as being the reason they're doing this.
Anyone else on this one? Yeah, and I'll do Camille and then Nick.
Oh yeah, I was thinking about what Ambrose was saying about sometimes you just want to be in your villain era. I think something for me in how I play characters is that I have been trying to kind of push the boat into playing more sort of like morally grey characters. And I had such a blast. I think maybe the favorite character I've played is in an Alien campaign I played in, where I played a non-binary character called Leah Davis. And they were just pretty morally grey. They were kind of out there for themselves mostly, working for Wayland Yutani, working under capitalism, but just like kind of wanting to get a leg up themselves however they could. Was incredibly antagonistic with some of the other characters in the group. But also I don't know. I think it was really fun to kind of push the bat out for me in terms of kind of like playing that character who just was really quite gruff and showed that like dissatisfaction under capitalism, particularly. I think that was very cathartic. And yeah, I really enjoyed that. And I mean, even though it was in a horror scenario, like a survival horror alien scenario, um, managed to like get a little romance, a little queer romance in there, which was nice. Ultimately, it did not work out well for Leah, in terms of being alive. But I think I had a blast like being able to just play through their character and kind of their story and just kind of yeah, experience them and kind of be able to play that. And I don't know, it felt like a really interesting story and being able to kind of explore that character fully. So even though things did not work out, and sorry for any spoilers for anyone who hasn't listened to it, it felt worthwhile like telling that story. And I was quite aware of playing a queer character who was a bit more like kind of morally grey, but I kind of felt as a non-binary person myself, I felt kind of a bit of confidence behind me going into playing that character and kind of exploring that. And yeah, I did definitely find it cathartic. Yeah, I guess another thing I just thought about earlier was how much we're still kind of getting out of that long hangover from like the Hays Code in like the 60s, and just how it was kind of like your queer people had to be villains or tragic, dead and buried, bury your gays, because such immoral activities had to be shown to lead you to ruin, kind of thing. And just how much that has kind of affected, yeah, queer coding in villains particularly, and also in kind of like tragic characters. And it would be nice not to have that history, because then maybe we could just be like, yeah, let's explore some queer villains. Let's see what's going on with that. But it's almost like we've got this really heavy weight on our shoulders that we're still trying to kind of get off a bit to just be able to explore all that with less complication and less pain. But yeah, we're definitely not there yet, and it can feel like a bit of a tightrope sometimes, I think, sort of exploring queer horror in general, and especially like villainy and antagonism and things like that. But um yeah, I also think that queer people can do some pretty awesome things with that and exploring that and subverting it as well. So yeah, I'm still figuring it out.
Nick, what about you?
I was thinking about there's two pieces of media that I've consumed within the last 6 months where when I was watching it, there something didn't sit right, and I couldn't put my finger on it until just recently. It was the Netflix Fall of the House of Usher story, and then also Penny Dreadful, where there are villainous characters who they are queer or they engage in queer behaviors, but it's not that they're doing it because they're gay. It's almost like, or they're queer, sorry. Um it's almost like just a piece of clothing or set dressing. It's just like an added thing. It almost feels like what they're trying to say is, oh, this person will fuck anything, so they must be bad. They'll just like take advantage of everyone in any kind of way. And it feels exceptionally put on and unnecessary. And when we talk about, harmful representation, that definitely feels like it's moving towards that, where you can't just kind of like use it as a color to paint with. There has to be more, as everyone's been saying. There has to be something like deeper. It has to be a more fully realized incorporation of the queerness of someone or the gender identity of someone. And I think one way I can't. I'm totally blanking on media that's done this well. I've seen it done in games pretty well. The idea, which again goes back to the idea of balance of more well-rounded three-dimensional characters. You know, histories written by the victor. It really is. It can just be a struggle between two groups or two individuals. It doesn't necessarily have to be that they're queer and they're evil, you know, or they're queer and they're just awful. It can just be that it's two opposing viewpoints or goals, and that's what we mean by antagonist.
I think, and Candace.
I have a counterpoint to that. I agree with thing about the antagonist versus the villain. I feel like there's a lot of media that's doing that's doing that well. For me, the first and probably most ready-made one is Killmonger as a black antagonist rather than a specific villain. He doesn't just like want to kill everybody for no reason. Like he's got actual points that he makes that are very important and has a good point and ends up affecting the hero by the end of the movie, right? The hero comes out of his shell and extends all of the gifts of Wakanda to the greater world because of that message that he is open to receiving from the antagonist, despite the fact that they fight to the death, which I think is a beautiful story arc and very powerful. I feel like there's something that I'm missing right now that is a queer standpoint of that, where someone's like, why are we doing that? I feel like Jennifer's body gets close to that idea, but doesn't quite connect. But I do feel like it splashes in that water a little bit with the idea of like, why should I care about these people? They don't care about me, you know, like monolith as queer people. But when I watched that show, I got a very different reading out of it. I love that show because to me, the queerness is presented rather than painting, in my opinion. Like, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but like the way that I read it was their sexuality doesn't matter. Everybody was open. Everybody was fluid, right? Sorry. Everybody was fluid. There's like maybe 2 or 3 obvious heterosexual relationships within that show, and then that's it, right? You've got the cop who has a beautiful, long-lasting family relationship with his husband. They have, you know, a whole life together that is only marred by the fact that the cop works so much, right? Or the lawyer works so much. And then you've got like these rich people. And to me, the paintbrush that they're painted with are rich people are shitty, right? Rather than the queer thing. And I think that like, part of my understanding of that definitely goes with the heteronormative kind of world that we live in that is very much coupled within classism and elitism, right? Like people on top, the wealthy, like we're all afraid to be caught smoking weed in public, and we're afraid to do cocaine, and we're afraid to be polyamorous, and we have to have a family with a husband and a wife, and we have to have kids, and we have to, there's this whole system for people who are not wealthy of how to be in this world that drives the point of making more workers to keep those rich people wealthy, right? Which is why gay people are the villain. Nobody used to give a shit about gay people, right? We've been around since the dawn of time. Why did it matter? Because capitalism, right? You need people to staff your companies, right? So if you're not having sex and not having children, you're automatically worth less in the grand scheme of things. But then there's so many gay people that are in the closet that are wealthy, right? They on the outside, they look like they're perfectly normal, right? They have this, you know, they have this visage of being, you know, like the leaders of that traditional sensibility when they have like boy servants in their home, right? Behind closed doors. And I feel like that's the message that I got from the House of Usher, is that these people have so much money and they feel that they are so untouchable that that's like a background issue, right? They happen to be gay, they happen to be bisexual or pansexual or whatever. But like, that's almost like just a category, like that's like one of many things that they are, but the umbrella is that they are shitty because they're rich. So like when I want to watch them fall, I mean, fall is in the name of the show, right? Like that's more how I watched it. But I do understand your perspective though, that from an outsider, right? A non-queer person, maybe that is what they get, right? Maybe that is a very slippery slope for someone coming outside of our community like, oh, so these people are rich, sure, but they're evil because they're gay. Like, I can totally see how someone would pick that up.
I think also the idea of it was always going to be kind of a smutty show. And I just want to say that I loved that show. And that it was just like that one thing that was like kind of in the back of my mind, or like something
Sure.
stuck in my teeth. But the idea was they wanted to show like as much sex and as much gore as they possibly could. And so a way to do that was by making all the characters bisexual or pansexual. And that's why it felt a little flat for me. But also, I mean, like, I definitely do appreciate the fact that they went that route, you know, as opposed to to bringing the sexuality more as a reason for their shittiness, or like more integral to their shittiness. Yeah, but I did love that show. I don't want anyone to mistake this. It's a good show.
And I saw Perry go hand up, and then Ambrose. Just
Okay.
to sort of,
No, we can go to Ambrose.
okay.
Oh,
Ambrose.
all I was gonna do is give an example, maybe of like the foil and like a foil and like a protagonist. It's not really horror, and I'm not sure because I only watched like a few episodes of it, and I was hooked, and then I forgot that it existed. Killing Eve. So like that was like that where it was like, oh hey, here's someone that's trying to hunt down this serial killer, and then here's a serial killer, and then like that there's like, oh I really like you, oh you're great, and it's just like, and I'm like, ooh, I love this so much, and I love that cat and mouse type of relationship between people, but I never like watched the rest of it, but I never like, again, I just forgot about it. There's nothing wrong with it. I thought it was like very well put together, and I'm like, I love this so much. Like looking at like both of these characters. That's all I was gonna say.
That was fantastic discussion. And so I have no choice but to move us on to our next topic, though, because we're constantly getting closer and closer to 4:50, or at 4:50 Eastern U.S. time, so 50 after the hour. What about the supernatural? I think in our notes I had mentioned that one of the things I really struggled with American Horror Story in New York was the mythologizing of the AIDS crisis, of trying to add some supernatural science fiction components to the outbreak of AIDS in the early 80s and the rapid spread of it. And I'm not saying that's inherently bad. That was something that I sort of like had a intense gut check reaction to. Where, and we also, I also get that we probably all mostly want to veer away from all gay people are magical, which is a thing that like comics experimented with in the 90s, where like we had, I forget the name of the comic, where all queer people suddenly develop magic powers or superpowers. Where do we find queer focused horror stories bringing in supernatural components that how does that work for you? How do you imagine that working when you bring the supernatural in, and the way it relates to sexuality and gender? Candace.
Thank you for telling me that about American Horror Story New York, because I was gonna try to watch it. My father was caught up in the, oh god, I'm in the closet, I can't bring condoms on my date, I'm a bisexual man in the 80s, I hate myself sort of swing, and lost his battle with HIV/AIDS when I was 16. So that is very touchy for me, and I feel like there are a lot of pieces of media. I like Mike Flanagan a lot, but like the Midnight Club, for example, I feel like they just kind of splash it. They don't take the care that they need to in recognizing that this is something that affects more than just like gay men over the age of 50, right? I feel like a lot of people think it's like this microcosm, like it's this bubble there, and we don't have to really warn other people about it, but there are still ripples that people are dealing with, 30, 40 years on. So thank you for that content warning, so that I know that going in. But I think that if it is something that is queer made, I like a good queers have superpowers. I like a good queers are magical fairies. I love that, right? Like, I want to be a magical fairy. Yes, let me live my best fairy life. When it's something that everyone can consume, no. But I think so this is a really stupid example, but one of the stories that I find interesting and touching about that kind of like has that notion of the supernatural within like queer spaces is The Magicians. The TV show is on Sci-Fi. It starts off really terrible, but stick with it. It does come around to get slightly better. That is a show that is not afraid to discuss queer tropes. There is a queer character named Elliot, who is just exceptional in every way, and a very complicated character that experiences a lot of good and a lot of bad. They paint gods and goddesses and people higher up in the process as being more sexually fluid, so people aren't as like pent up and kind of afraid of, you know, what lies beyond who they're supposed to be. And I think that the technique that they use, the principle that they use in that show, the mechanic for their magical system, is that the people who get magic are people who know trauma. So magic comes to you when you've had an extreme traumatic event. And for Elliot, right, their major queer character, I mean, their lead is bisexual, so that's already a bisexual man, which is already ahead of its time, really. There's so little representation for bisexual men in media that are positive. So Elliot, his like defining moment when he gets his magic, there's someone at his school, he's bullied for being gay as a kid and as a teenager. And there's another kid who's nice to him and is sweet to him and kind to him. And out of self-preservation, he kind of throws that kid under the bus. And then he gets hit by a car, right? And dies. So that's like his moment, is like a moment when he thought that he was just kind of protecting himself and keeping himself from harm, because he was trying to kind of avoid any kind of backlash because of who he is. And then it costs something real. And then he becomes magical. So I do really like the idea of magic being the result of pain, the ability to open your mind's eye to something bigger than yourself, because you are something bigger than what people can understand. I think there's something really beautiful about that. I don't love that it's tied to pain, because so much of our stories are, but I do think that it's a nice kind of middle ground between acknowledging how traumatic it is to be queer in a straight world, and how traumatizing it can be. It's not traumatizing for everyone, which is lovely. Hopefully that scale tips in the future and keeps getting better. But it's a nice balance between that inherent trauma in being this other, and then being other for a reason that's actually beautiful and interesting and exciting and can change your life in a good way.
Ambrose.
Hello. So what I would say, kind of like, I like that we have like a very similar but like just slightly different Candace in terms of like perceiving, because I agree with that. When it comes to the supernatural for me, and I think I alluded to it like the first question we like had, I like experimenting with otherness and separation. I like the horror that's self-reflective, so like psychological, or like something that you sit with and like relate to it. So I like mirroring effect or shadow relaying. So like I tend to use those elements a lot with writing, storytelling, and stuff like that. For me, it's like, hey, what is that thing you hide from yourself, or you're not even sure that you're hiding from yourself, or you think you know about yourself? And how can we bring you to confront those things? And I take that and I will turn it into something supernatural, whether it's horrifying, which I love doing, or just in general magical, something that makes it supernatural, like what best relates to those things. Exploring trauma, or exploring like the good that comes from trauma, because like you learn something about yourself. Sometimes you stay stuck in it. Unfortunately, some people stay stuck in the trauma because it layers on. They can never get past it, or they finally find a way past it and they use it as a strength. Like, how does that translate? And I always have a lot of fun articulating that into something that is creative, beautiful, expressive, in that way. So for me, art, before, when I went through a lot, that was the way I did that. Creating a character that uses art that comes to life as a way to like kind of relaying that to like, oh, hey, like something bad happened, turn that into like that trauma turns into something magic. And it relates back to something like that is something that is beautiful and wonderful. Horror wise, creating a actual shadow self that can turn monstrous, or can benefit you depending on how you grow. That is like a character that I made, or like a magical, like a, in terms of writing like what is it, like writing a monster or entity, and how like they react based off of interactions with people. Like, oh yeah, monstrous, because that's what could end up happening. That's how trauma can manifest. Or you do the self-reflection, and how does that translate? And I had a lot of fun creating something like that, where like, hey, how do you see it through life, and what happens to you, and how does it hurt other people, or does it like make you better in the long term? Does it make you magical?
And Perry.
So there's a number of things off of everything that's been said here, because I also grew up during the 80s, so I at the height of the AIDS crisis, and that aspect of coming out and what it meant to come out, and having so many of my family members and friends thinking as soon as I acknowledged I was gay, that it also meant I was having a death sentence put on top of myself, that AIDS at some point was going to be taking that sect. But one of the other aspects to even what Ambrose has just brought up is the issue of and when I deal with clients who are dealing with survivor guilt about that period of time, is the issue of nostalgia, and how we take nostalgia and either are angry about it, or we've romanticized it. And that romanticizing can also easily lead into the creation of those mythologies and the stories that a time in the past was better than now, even though it was no different than now. And we're seeing that also in other areas of our world, not just in queer culture, but the standpoint that the past holds this allure that we can keep going back to, and that it was never dark or grimy or unpleasant. And even the standpoint of what you're talking about with trauma is the standpoint, there's trauma, which can be a very singular event, and then we have what's known as complex trauma, which is multiple traumatic events that become layered and then get further into extreme complex trauma, and then dissociative identity disorder as well. That is possible for every person given the right circumstances. Just look at Moon Knight as an example of that. But even further, what comes to mind is Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray, which in many ways can be coded as a queer story about holding on to again, romanticized idea of themselves and all the trauma that continues to build up through life, which gets stored in the picture, as opposed to showing up on the individual as their experience of aging. And even the question about aging is about having all these experiences, as opposed to being locked in an ideal of experiences. So when we're not just looking at mythology, but we're looking at creating stories, especially queer horror stories, how much are we also using this nostalgia both in its reality versus its romanticized mythological sides too?
Camille.
Maybe about sort of introducing the supernatural into kind of queer and horror scenarios, that maybe there can be kind of a possible element of othering in terms of like supernatural representation. I just was thinking about the whole thing of like non-binary representation. You kind of find it in like aliens and robots, and things like that, and how you maybe into like, I know we've been talking about like vampires as a bit of a tired trope as well. And Candace, it's interesting how you mentioned like the gods having kind of a different approach to like sexuality and like gender and stuff. And how sometimes if that is like maybe the only representation, it's maybe there could be a bit of like an othering there in terms of like, oh, these like mythical entities are non-binary, or trans, or have different sexualities. And whereas, regular Joe Schmo is your cishet like rep. And yeah, so it's interesting from that perspective. But I think particularly if you have kind of like more supernatural things happening to protagonists who are queer, or like, thinking in terms of like games, if you have kind of like queer players with queer characters who are kind of exploring supernatural stuff, there's more sort of agency there, I guess, in a way. Or maybe in terms of stories of just regular human characters where weird supernatural stuff happens and they change, or ways of exploring it. I guess yeah, that could be maybe more of a less of an othering thing. Yeah, but I mean, also I love all the stuff about like in What We Do in the Shadows, or like they're vampires. They've lived for hundreds of years. They don't give a fuck about sexuality. They just do what they want. I'm like, I do love that. Like, I definitely have a soft spot for that for sure. And I guess it's the joy of just having all different kinds of representation and just having a lot of variety, I think is the key.
Anything? And I'll do Nick and then Candace.
I actually, this isn't so much a like an opinion as it is actually a question, because it's something that I think about. TRPGs especially can be, when done right, a safe space to kind of explore ideas or aspects of a personality. And so when you're bringing in the supernatural, there's a part of me that wonders if that kind of that bringing in the supernatural or the mythologizing is a tool that can be used to kind of soften the landing for that kind of exploration, or even make it easier for, in some way, for people who don't experience that to grok it. Yeah, yeah. And I'm wondering if if that extends to queerness, or if it feels too dangerous to do. And I think Perry's got an opinion. So,
Candace, is it okay with you if before we kind of circle back to you to kind of get all right?
So it's not an opinion, but it's actually a technique we use in therapy called externalization. And often we use it much more with kids, but it can be used at any age in the standpoint of one client I had, we externalized her fear as, at first, an amorphous blob. And then we pushed it into a shape that she could now interact with. And so much of what we even do with those who are geek therapists using TTRPs to work with our clients is to create that externalization so that we can have that conversation and that identity with it. Another variant of that is what's also we know in therapy called the empty chair method, where you have a conversation with another part of yourself, or in this case, the personification of whatever this shadow, whatever this doubt, whatever this insecurity is. So TTRPs are in many ways are just doing the same thing that we do in therapy, maybe just not necessarily with the control or the awareness of the psychological principles that are going on as well. So, to Candace.
Candace.
I was just going to piggyback off of what Camille was saying. Something that you were talking about, oh, well, like in What We Do in the Shadows, they just do what they want because they're hundreds of thousands of years old, right? They're tens of thousands of years old, and like, who cares anymore, right? I think that there's something so powerful about that mentality and that concept within fantasy and horror and the mystical and magical. I think that there's a lot of, whether we want to or not, there's a lot of supernatural or fantasy story that does get us, right? Where it hits home in a very personal way and it challenges who we are as people, right? Like, I'm sure there are tons of cis, straight, white men who read Lord of the Rings and saw Aragorn and were like, that is my dude. I am going to be so noble from now on. I am going to walk right into the mouth of the beast. I am going to slay dragons in real life. Like, I'm going to stand up, right? There's a certain empowerment in reading something like that or seeing something like that. And I think that, like, as harmful as it can be to show, certain supernatural versions of queerness, I also think that it's also a kind of a very powerful driver to help people who might not understand those pieces of themselves, right? Like, for example, the new She-Ra cartoon has a character named Double Trouble that's a villain, or an anti-hero, I should say. Double Trouble does whatever they want. And I feel like, especially for a kid or a young person that's watching that, understanding that, like, the way that you are isn't strange and isn't weird and isn't awkward. There's something a little bit fancy or special to, like, recognize that in yourself, but also see it in a character that is magical, right? Like, imparting a little bit of that magic into yourself sometimes feels so beautiful and can be so validating. So I just wanted to shout out what Camille said, because, like, I feel like that is, like, very powerful. Like, I can't imagine being somebody who is very quiet or in the closet about your sexuality and then watching what we do in the shadows and just seeing Laszlo be this like manly man who like speaks like a manly man, right? Like he's like a gentlemanly vampire, but like is indiscriminate with who he welcomes into his bed, right? If you're sexy, you're sexy. If you've got it, right? Even though that's a fictional character and it's a silly fictional character, that kind of mindset of if the person's cool, then they're cool, might stay with a person and really affect them. So I think that it can be a very powerful tool if used properly.
I just wanted to jump in with a great Laszlo quote that I love, which is just gay is in, gay is hot. I want some gay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love
He's a role model for us all.
He is. He's my guy.
So I think I'm going to skip ahead in our list of questions a little bit because I want to get to this because I think several of us were sort of excited to discuss it. Queer horror as incompatible or compatible or incompatible with queer joy. American horror, not American Horror Story. American horror for much of the 80s, 90s. Like once Halloween came out and our version of the slasher sort of matured, we almost never gave anybody a happy ending for any reason. It was just mass destruction and survivor trauma were the plot, and don't have sex with anyone for any reason. Was the subtext, and then it became text. Like by the mid 80s, it firmly became text. But other horror subgenres, other sort of international trends in horror don't seem to like separate out that notion that the possibility of joy is incompatible with a terrible thing happening right this moment. So what about queer horror and queer joy? Where do we find that, especially in the gaming space? How do you sort of set up as a GM or a player the possibility that you are confronting horror right now, but you have the possibility of queer joy out there? Ambrose.
Because I can't think of an example in terms of media, but definitely as like a GM setting up, like I was like, oh yeah, that's a fair point. Quick talking about that, like I think I don't know. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, because again, media literacy, I'm learning. I apologize. But when it comes to any amount of media, I can't see there being joy and like horror in the same go, just in general, because even if there is a little bit of joy, like let's say it starts off where, oh, we bought a new house, like it's perfectly priced for us, like it holds the whole family, and then there's the audience viewing like perfectly priced in the neighborhood you wanted, all that other stuff. That's a little too good to be true, but it didn't have anything to do with their identity or anything like that. It was just like, oh, their joy, queer joy, in terms of like, oh hey, it's a same-sex marriage, or like a full family, like just in general going, and no one treats them horribly, but the horror is in the house, right? Like where, oh, it's a ghost, has nothing to do with who they are, but there is the joy that starts it off, right? Where for setup purposes, what I tend to do is like, hey, because I love investigative horror, because like, oh, we're hunting a monster of some sort that has nothing to do with the characters themselves. It's like, oh, hey, there's two characters that are in a romantic relationship together, and they're slowly like learning about each other, or they went out for like dinner, or they are going for coffee. And I will always ask like, hey, we're in the middle of a situation. Are you okay with something outside happening? Or if you want to just have this joy here? I usually ask that because it's like, hey, we've been through a lot. Like this, we did a lot of stuff that was really heavy. Did you want to have those moments of like just downtime? And for being like a GM specifically for Powered by the Apocalypse, Monster of the Week, there is downtime between monster sessions, right? So it's just like, did you want your downtime? It might give you some hints about the next thing, but it's not going to like bother you unless you decide you want to pursue the lead in the middle of a date. or in the middle of that downtime where you're watching a movie and you're just talking with each other. So I want to build in that joy because it's heavy stuff, especially like if a character had a development with like the person that they love, or they found out that they were lying to them and they want to process that, or like, oh, hey, I realize I love you. And it's not just a situationship or whatever that might be. It is, I love you. And it hits me in the feels because I'm playing the NPC of like, oh my God, give me a moment. Okay. Like, I didn't expect this to go this way. And let's deal with that joy and like, give it breath and a moment to live versus smothering it immediately with like, oh, a ghost just crashed through the like the window and literally ripped their soul asunder. Like that's rude. Like that's not that's not fair. But if someone's okay with it, I will ask like this is, or when I set up a game, I'm like, this is just going to be horror, straight up horror. No breaks, no joy. You can have those moments, but I'm letting you know that that's not what the story is. I'll let you know. I'm not going to just do that to you if it's like a long-term campaign, right? That's mean. That's just mean. Like, come on. So,
Camille.
Yeah, I think I was sort of considering this question the other day, and I think one of the things that I really enjoy is that I don't know if queer horror is exactly compatible with queer joy, but I think there's something very interesting in how they can be mixed together. Like I think there's a real kind of bittersweetness to that, and it's interesting when Ambrose was saying about how some of it is just like this is just horror. You can have those sweet moments, but they're probably gonna get taken away at some point. I kind of live for that stuff, and it was just a masochistic streak in me. But I think that in setting up characters for horror scenarios, particularly if I'm playing like a short scenario where it is more like Cthulhu Dark, or like I've played 10 Candles before, which is a game where it's very much like you're probably not going to survive. It's very nihilistic. And there's something I really enjoy about that, maybe weirdly, because partly it's just like, well, I'm going to make this character, I'm going to really think about their backstory, about who they are, what their dreams are, what their hopes are, what they want, what their motivations are, just knowing that it's all just going to go to shit. Like it's none of that's going to be realized. But partly there's, I don't know, like a little bit of a catharsis in kind of being able to explore that character's life and their wants and kind of like build that up to then lose it. You know, I think there's something really, really interesting in that. I think that sometimes that's not what I want, for sure. I think sometimes, yeah, that can be quite miserable, but there's definitely an element to me that's really interesting. There's just that bittersweetness to it. Like it, yeah, it tastes bad, but it tastes interesting and complex, you know? Yeah, so I think maybe, I don't know if they're compatible, but I think, yeah, when they're put together, that can be an interesting contrast or kind of like narrative element.
Candace.
I agree with that. That masochism that you're talking about made me smile. I feel like the place where queer joy exists, like in tabletop, or even if you are a creator that is making like a queer movie or television show or book or comic, etc., like there's so much bad stuff that is potentially going to happen to you the moment that you decide to own who you are as a queer person, whether you want it or not, whether you're in a beautiful little bubble where everyone you know is gay and you forget straight people exist, and then one day somebody calls you the F word in the middle of the street and you're just like, wait, what? Right? Like, even if you leave it behind, it's always going to be there. And I think that like there's something so powerful about being in a queer scenario, playing a queer character, and knowing it's going to be awful and signing up for that as a way to control the bad that you accept into your life. I think that is a very kind of visceral and meta concept of queer joy. I always know that there is the potential for that. I'm in at the table. I am in a podcast called Otherworld Hollywood, which is by 12 Sided Stories, and it's a Call of Cthulhu podcast set in the 1950s in like old Hollywood. And most of our table is queer. and most of our characters are queer. And when we started having the conversation about how we were going to tell the story, the GM, who is straight, was like, listen, I want to make sure that I'm doing right by all of y'all. You are bringing me complex and beautiful queer characters. Some of them are Black or Latin characters, right, as well. How do we feel about this being set in the 50s? Like, what conversations are we having? What are we leaving in the past? Do we want to do a revisionist history? Are we in regular history, but some things don't matter as much? So as a table, we kind of decided, you know, the issues of race are something that are just too, there's just too much depth there. And there's a divide that is too strong to venture into those subjects. So we were going to kind of keep those at bay. We were going to tuck those away. But we wanted to have the conversation about what queerness looks like at that time, what freedom looks like at that time, and how all of us can reach that even though eldritch horrors are coming for us, right? So there's a very huge amount of love and so and kind of queer metaphor that goes into that storytelling. And like one of the characters is like an Elvira type, but like a vampira from the 40s and 50s, and she's living with her gay husband, right? She's a lesbian, and they live in this this perfect marriage, and everybody's like, look at this couple, because like that was real, right? That was something that people did all the time, and honestly still do, to protect their careers and themselves. And have a very real conversation about what that looks like and the care that exists within that relationship, even though it's platonic. Having those conversations in order to hopefully, shine a light on the people that are listening that are queer and love hearing of these stories and love rooting for these characters, but also to kind of twist and change the mind of a person who's listening to this and seeing the parallels between what we have now and what we had then, right? Like, it's very kind of easy to compare those two things and mirror them against each other as far as our advancement and how far we still have left to go. So I feel like the moments of queer joy, even though it's a dark campaign, even though it's a scary campaign, some terrible things are happening. There are some terrible gays in it as well, alongside our heroes. Some of our heroes are very complicated and might not even want the name hero to be brandished upon them. But being able to kind of have that conversation in those bright spots, to Ambrose's point, where you have those moments where things are good. You have those moments. Someone was turned into a werewolf by someone who is now their lover, right? A woman who is now in love with her, and they're a baby werewolf and a grown werewolf that are teaching each other the ropes about each other and the world they live in. Right? It's beautiful. Like, it's a beautiful conversation about already being othered in this world and then putting another other on top of that. And how do you survive? Right. So there's such like multifaceted storytelling that you can do with that. But I also really enjoy, like in media, like in Yellow Jackets, for example, there's a beautiful queer couple in Yellow Jackets, and they are it's a situation where they are in the beginning of the movie, in the beginning of the show, they're together. No one knows they're in high school. It's fresh and young and new. And then they crash land in the middle of the Canadian wilderness. And they're still together, and their bond strengthens, and they communicate more. Something bad happens. They're still together. Like, they are like the heart and soul of all of those flashback scenes, because they have something greater than themselves that they owe something to. And watching their connection is so, like, just the depth is just outstanding, because it's like, this is what people are doing. Even in the face of all of this, there is still that love. And then to serve as a foil to that, there's someone who's in the closet with his boyfriend, and nobody knows that he's gay, and he's isolated by his memories. He can't take pleasure or joy in his queerness because it was something that he was ashamed of, and now he doesn't know if he'll ever be able to go back to it. Right? So like, having that kind of duality of how queerness manifests within trauma or within like an emergency or within horror and terror, I think is something that's so powerful to explore. And I feel like those moments of resilience are part of queer joy. It might not be joy in the traditional sense where everything's fine and dandy and the world is wonderful and, we're whispering on the wing of a butterfly or whatever. But like, it is joyful to know that the world beats us down. We become more resilient. We come out on the other side of things, whereas someone else might struggle or fail. That's like a different definition of joy, I think, for me.
Ambrose.
In regards, like, I think, because that's amazing, by the way, thank you for telling some of those stories, because like, it hit me right here, Jesus. But it is a lot of like, joy isn't just like joy, it's bittersweetness too. Because like what a way to enjoy life, the ups and downs in a normal way. And that normal way isn't just like the height, it's also like the lulls. It's also, like when you fall in love with someone or you're in love with someone, you love seeing the good in it, as well as like those moments when you can't stand each other and then coming back together and apologizing, or maybe it's a thing you're working on to fully understand why y'all were upset with each other. That is like a beautiful thing to have. Joy is that. And then of course there's like, this is like a hyperbole kind of situation, then there's like the horror element, the supernatural, the weird of that overtone of like, hey, the joy doesn't have to dip into something that like causes death or causes pain or anything like, or suffering, because hey, the joy, their life together, is the bittersweet journey, which I absolutely love. The only other thing that I was gonna say, and it kind of goes back to like making a game, where like, hey, like include everybody and stuff like that. Um, in regards to what I like to do, and I think everyone should do this. This might go into the realm of safety. One, it's okay to ask what kind of game this is and where you want, like to ask questions just in general, because I've had several times when I'm okay with doing something. No one talked about or asked questions about it at the beginning, but I'm like, hey, I don't mind playing a pansexual person. I'm not pansexual. I am ace, very. But I love seeing, like, I love flirting with people. It's the funniest thing in the world. Like that's just me. Where I'm like, hey, I love like, hey, how you doing? What's up? But I love acting that character out. Like that's a lot of fun for me. But a lot of people assume that I carry over demisexual or aceness into my character. I'm like, no, just ask. Like, I just need to know what the marks are. That's about it. Like, if this is acting. Or at the very beginning of session 0, like, hey, are you okay with being romanced or not? Or do you have like whatever lines? Um, I'm okay with that. I'm always okay with it, to explore those things. I would love to play just a ace character, which I'm finally going to be able to do. I'm like, hey, I'm just here. Like I'm a hitman vampire that just wants to like do a little murder and just giggle. Like so like Vera Arrow Ace is like what that character is, and I always wanted to play a character like that and explore it. The other thing that I would do for setup is I make a primer. So just in general, like this is a descriptor. These are the themes. This is what we're going to be touching on. Do you feel like this is something you want to explore? And it's okay if it's not. Just not the game for you. I would love to play another game with you, and it's okay. This is just a no for this. And it's okay because sometimes I just want to horror. I just want to like tumble and shout through it and like just like probably die if I'm a player character, maybe. Let's tell that story. But like if we want moments of joy longer term, and like I can make that game too, and I love those games. So yeah, just that's about it. That is just me reiterating some stuff. So yeah.
Thank you. And Nick.
In the context of TRPGs again, I feel like you all are discussing such high ideas, and I'm going to drag us down with talks about mechanics. The complexity that comes in with having the horror and the joy side by side, I think can also have the other side of the coin effect from what you were talking about, Ambrose, which is like those moments of respite. They can also really heighten the horror if you have these like beautiful moments of connection, like true connection. It makes all of the bad stuff so much worse. And it makes it like feel bad when it's not only happening to your character but also to other people's characters. I just recently had the pleasure of playing a game called Public Access, where it's built into the game. Yeah, y'all know. And it truly surprised me because I'd never played a game like that before, where when you are vulnerable with someone, when you are working on that connection, it really does enhance just the sinking feeling of, oh my gosh, everything is falling apart. So both. It serves both. You get a rest, and then you're back in the shit, and it's way worse than it was.
All right. We are almost out of time, so I would love to get y'all's sort of closing thoughts, or a goodbye statement, whichever you'd like to, however you want to think about that. And then, where can people find you online, if anywhere? It's fine to say, "Don't look for me online." Um, you're all humans who deserve your privacy. Are there streams? Are there social media accounts? Things like that. And I think what I'm going to do is, Nick, you had the last comment, so I'm going to snake backwards from there and pick on you first. Closing thought, and sort of where do people look for you?
Closing thought. First of all, this has been such a pleasure. You all are amazing. Um, I feel like there's only progress to be made, and if you're playing games, especially, it's not that you have to again find the token queer person to play at your table, but learning more about how to bring that representation, especially if you're doing actual play, especially if you're publishing. It's important. Everyone, if you're not a part of the community, allyship is welcomed and encouraged. And I think that it extends to every genre, but it feels like there is something really special about horror specifically, where it would be too easy to make one-dimensional characters, one-dimensional villains, but there is a richness to be had by just learning more, which will also enrich you as a human being. So, good stuff. Try to represent. Uh, don't look for me online, but do look for Ain't Slayed Nobody, a Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast where I am always trying to make trouble. And thank you again to everyone.
Ambrose, you don't mind
It
one
snaked to
second?
me. I didn't realize. I thought it was going to go Perry. Sorry. I
Sorry,
was like,
sorry,
oh.
sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Hi, everybody. I'm Ambrose. My closing statement. I have been under a rock for 3 years. I know that is like a funny thing that I say, but it's also like something that like I am learning about myself. I'm learning about the community that I'm in, because I've been closed off, and learning about myself and learning about other people and how amazing their stories are. And I'm doing that through obviously talking more, being okay with me and showing myself to others. And through that journey, I have settled into horror, in order to tell those stories and tell the stories of others, as well as connecting with people. And horror is one of those things where I love to explore a concept, a thought of like a what if, and then just blow it out of proportion to the point where you don't even know what the what if was from the person from the mind that it was generated from. And it's like my favorite thing in the world, to like get y'all invested on the edge of your seat. It is my absolute favorite thing to do. And I will not stop until we get that. That is my joy, my pride. Um, but um, but with that, like meeting all of you today, and also re-meeting some of you today, and like seeing y'all again, has been wonderful. If possible, please send everything that y'all mentioned in terms of movies, TV shows, media, my way, because like that is, again, been under a rock for a very long time. I'm coming out, like just scrappy, learning as much as I can. So please do. I watched a lot, but some of these like, oh, I didn't even consider that. Okay, please send them my way. You can put it in the chat. You can find me online. I'm SS Ambrose _ on Twitter and Instagram, because those places definitely hate me, but everywhere else I'm SS Ambrose. I am the creative director and founder of Othersider Studios. That's Othersider STD, or Othersider Studios on Twitch, and YouTube. We are coming back with Arcane Core, the second half of the season 3 at some point this year. Stay tuned. That is a Monster of the Week actual play. And it is getting intense and wonderful. We're going to take our time telling that story and wrapping it up. You can find me on the Lovely Craftians podcast, which will be coming back for season 5. I do not know when, but I can't say anything. Just know that our system is changing. Still eldritch in nature, but please stay tuned for that. I think that I'm an award-winning TTRPG performer, best Chaosium player of 2023, and we'll see if we can get any more awards. Gib. But yeah, thank y'all. You have all been so wonderful. See.
Perry.
So I'm going to add my 2 cents on our ending subject around queer joy and queer suffering. There's a lot of things in our society, and even the dramas that we're putting forth, that suffering is sort of a goal. It's sort of fed into that idea, and larger structures and so forth, that suffering is necessary. What a biggest thing I want you to consider taking away, whether we're talking about queer joy or queer trauma, whether you're writing horror novels, in whatever aspect is, how are we making ourselves vulnerable, not just to suffering, but to having joy? And in all of its various forms, even if it's the bittersweet ones, the more that we are able to find what makes that vulnerability and that joy there is important. And I know as I sit with clients, the aspects of how have they made themselves vulnerable to joy, and how can I help them make them, how have they made themselves vulnerable to suffering, and how can I help them make themselves more vulnerable to joy and accepting that as being part of their reality. So we're going to be scared. We're also going to be happy too. So otherwise, where you can find me, if most of the time I'm at my practice, untying knots, some more names. Untangle and Grow Counseling is my private practice here in the San Francisco Bay. Otherwise, I have my podcast, Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered, which you can find on any of the podcast players. And periodically, you can find me over on Symphony Entertainment as a character there. So if you can check any of those places, you'll be able to find a contact to me.
Awesome. Candace.
I was muted. I have been Candace. I guess my wrap up is I don't know. This has been so wonderful, and it's felt so comfortable and nurturing. I've been super creepy and super queer my whole life, so it's been really great talking about some special interests today. And I just really feel very lucky to have been involved in this panel and to be able to talk with and learn from each of you. You can find me at the Candace Murray on Twitter and Blue Sky. You can find me at Candace Magnificent everywhere else for the most part. I do a lot of stuff. Social is probably the best place to figure out what I'm doing. I know if you like podcasts, you can hear me in the Last Voice podcast, which is like a micro fiction podcast about a survivor at the end of the zombie apocalypse. I'm in this new season. You can hear me every Wednesday in Otherworld Hollywood, which is 12-sided stories. They do mostly horror podcasts. We also have a mothership campaign that I'm in that just launched recently. You can see me every other Saturday in What We Do in the Shallows, which is a 5e horror pirate campaign, D&D pirate campaign over on Matihi's channel. And then there's some cool stuff coming up. I have a new podcast that I'm launching with members of the Atomless. That's all about the horror of being a creator and a creative. I've got some charity events for Palestine coming up in the next week or two. So yeah, just check out my social, and I usually post before I go live and retweet whatever things I'm in. Thank you for having me.
Camille?
Yes, I think maybe one of my sort of final parting thoughts, particularly when we were talking about kind of the compatibility of queer horror and queer joy, is that I was very much reminded of that phrase of like queer joy as resistance, and how I think that maybe horror and horror gaming particularly can be an amazing sandbox for exploring queer joy as resistance, particularly if you're like resisting horrific creatures or whatever it happens to be that you're resisting. You can kind of like maybe explore some queer joy through kind of that as a metaphor. So yeah, I really loved what Perry said about making yourself vulnerable to joy as well. I'm a counselor in training. I would love to talk shop. That would be really cool. Yeah, as for me, I am part of the How We Roll podcast. We do a lot of Call of Cthulhu and Alien and Cult, and I'm doing a Cthulhu Dark campaign at the moment. We do Pulp Cthulhu, a lot of Cthulhu. And yeah, usually any campaign I'm in, there's going to be some gay. So, Always fun. I also have been in a couple of Ain't Slave Nobody campaigns as well. So yeah, good times. Me and Nick were actually both in the scenario Black Shade, run by Scott Dorward. I'm obsessed with it. It's like a Victorian scenario set in a women's asylum. So yeah, definitely some weird trauma and some horror and all sorts of stuff going on there. But that was really fun. I played a suffragette who got sent away for punching a politician. So, you know. Anyway, if you want to get in touch with me, I'm fairly active on the How We Roll Discord. If anyone's interested, it's a nice little community. I am on Blue Sky. I'm trying to use Blue Sky more often. I am there as Cammy Brew, brew like a cup of tea. So CAMIBREW. So that's another place you could see what I'm up to and get in touch.
All right. I am Richard Ruane. It has been a huge privilege to get to talk to this group of people today. And thank you to A Weekend with Good Friends for letting me moderate this. You can find me on Blue Sky, Twitter, Threads, and Instagram as Rook Studio, all one word. And I think we are just going to wave at the camera until David takes us out. I learned this from Tony Vicenda, but it's a good skill.